Welcome back to the In Chamber. I'm your host, Tom Schumann. In our last 5 conversations, we touched on but did not focus specifically on COVID-19. In a quick recap, those episodes featured higher education with Ron Rochon, president of the University of Southern Indiana, new business development and entrepreneurship with both Max Brickman of Heartland Ventures and Rob Martins of Allegion. We talked about marketing and keeping your customers with Ali Cudby of Your Iconic Brand. And also we got into the information technology world with Nick Smarelli of GoodellNet. Our 2 June conversations beginning today are going to tackle today's reality from both a national and a state perspective. Look at the challenges that we have both tomorrow and in the months to come. I'm going to read an introduction here that's quite a bit longer than we normally do, quite a bit and that's only because, and he's waving me off, telling me, no, don't read this, but there's a reason why. So we'll go through it quickly. Bruce Mehlman founded a bipartisan firm, Mehlman, Castanetti, Rosen, and Thomas, so Washington, D.C. based firm that helps Fortune 500 companies and innovative startups understand, anticipate, and navigate the policy environment and trends likely to impact the global marketplace. Bruce previously held the position of Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Technology Policy, having been nominated by President George W. Bush and confirmed by the U.S. Senate in 2021. He was a tech and telecom lobbyist for Cisco Systems, policy director and general counsel for the House Republican Conference under Representative J.C. Watts, general counsel to the National Republican Congressional Committee. But that's not why he's here today on the In Chamber. I had the opportunity to see Bruce at a national chamber conference in 2018, and he presents quarterly updates on political trends, and these are widely read by business leaders, political observers around the country. Bruce has a great style, a great presence in presenting this information, and he's going to do that for us today through this podcast. We've been working to bring him to Indiana since then. He was scheduled to present at the since canceled Indiana Chamber Board of Directors meeting in late May, but he's agreed to share his insights with you today through this conversation. Bruce Mehlman, welcome to the In Chamber.
Boy, thanks for having me, and I'm hoping you edit that down to 1 sentence, or else everybody's going to hate me before I even start.
Well, like I said, that was longer than most, but I had to give him that background. I had to give him a little sense of where you're coming from. So, Bruce, your experience, I mentioned quarterly trends. Talk about a tricky business. How long have you been doing this? How did you get started? And kind of what's the most difficult aspect of it?
Well, I'll start with the last. The hardest part of doing quarterly trends and predictions is getting anything right. The good news is usually folks don't seem to come back to you and say, hey, Mehlman, in 2016, you were pretty sure that Hillary Clinton was going to beat Marco Rubio for the presidency. What happened with that prediction? I've been doing it about 10 years. It in part reflects you'd mentioned in that long bio, way back when I worked at a company called Cisco Systems. And the old CEO of Cisco Systems is brilliant sales guy, John Chambers from West Virginia, although the company is in Silicon Valley. And Chambers was the only guy I ever saw who actually presented PowerPoints that you enjoyed. Everybody else writes a 2-page memo and cuts and pastes it onto the PowerPoint, and you want to shoot them because they turn their back and they just read it in front of you. And I can read, I don't need that. But he would, through visuals, and turns out among his other extraordinary things, he was dyslexic. So part of it is he didn't want a whole bunch of words. He wanted to narrate data or images that conveyed things. And I vowed at that point, like, I want to be like that guy. And so throughout my time there, my time in government, I would do a lot of presentations, and I would go full Elizabeth Dole style where, I didn't have notes. I didn't stand behind the lectern. I would stand in front of the stage like a Silicon Valley wannabe and just narrate interesting data. And I found there was a big appetite both to have me do that once I hit the private sector, but also so many people in business wanted to either spend a little bit more time with the charts to think about what it might mean for their operations, or wanted the charts so that they themselves could select some that that made sense so they could present it to their customers or suppliers or bosses out at headquarters. And so it's just this weird, goofy email chain of people who were sending it to people who would then email me if they could join, has led to where the one on COVID was about 110,000 downloads. It helps that it's completely free, and it probably helps that nobody is watching live sports on TV and everybody is stuck in their home on the internet. So what the hell else are you going to do?
So that elevated the readership of the last one. But Bruce, you're looking ahead, you're predicting, you're coming up with trends that relies on looking back at history. Are you a history buff, or how did this come to you? This looking back to help predict the future, so to speak.
Well, I am a history buff for sure, and that's both. I was a history major a long time ago in college, and have always, in my free time, read particularly nonfiction about history, either biographies of successful people, business leaders, government folks, or wars or other history. In some ways, though, I was a lot of these analyses for years were much more current eventy. So it was typically, where do we stand vis-a-vis the next election? Who's up? Who's down? What legislation might we expect from the House and the Senate? And what I found when I was presenting to a class is it was a class of executive MBA students. So, I'd say kids, but people between 25 and 35. And they told me I got the organization said you got the highest rating anybody ever got for being interesting. But the second most consistent comment is, this guy totally depressed me. And I thought, well, it's cool to be interesting, but I don't want to be the depressing guy. And so this was a couple of years ago. And what I started working into was, I started working into my presentation a new conclusion. And what it is as I had recounted the current state of affairs where inequality is at record high and new technology is leading to new competitors who were dominating across so many channels of the economy. And historic levels of immigration were both making the country stronger for diversity and for talent, but at the same time leading to a growing backlash and resentment by folks who had been here longer, but felt like they were getting jumped in a line they perceived they were in, and gridlock in politics. And what had occurred to me is that describes the Gilded Age in America. The late 1890s, the early 1900s, that describes it to a T. And recall, the Gilded Age saw the rise of populists like William Jennings Bryan with his famous Cross of Gold speech. And in the end, we didn't have an era of populism. We had an era of significant progressive reform. Teddy Roosevelt, followed by Taft, followed by Wilson. And you had things such as worker safety laws and food safety laws. To deal with inequality, they passed a progressive income tax as a constitutional amendment to deal with the new robber barons that back then, dominating these new industries nobody had ever heard of, like railroads or oil. They invented antitrust law. And to fix the political system, they had amendments to the Constitution to give women the right to vote, to have direct election of senators. You even take a look at things such as, there's an echo of this today, but the business leaders came to government leaders in the early 1900s and said, boy, there's an inconsistency of what we produce in our education system. We're trying to lead the world in this industrial revolution in the early 1900s, but American kids finish at most 8th grade and don't really learn skills that are relevant for factory work in the 20th century. And so it was called the high school movement. But around the country, every state ultimately said, we need a K-12 paid for by taxpayers, imparting the skills necessary for this new 20th century. And I set it up in my speaking as a surprise, where you thought I was talking about today, because that fits today to a T. But I pointed out that was the Gilded Age. It led to a lot of reforms. The reforms didn't undermine capitalism. The 20th century was the greatest triumph of capitalism in the history of the planet and capitalism. But it suggests that just because I believe in market systems and just because capitalism is the best system doesn't mean from time to time you don't need to adjust the dials. And so by offering the historical context, I was able to make myself less oppressive and less depressing.
Well, Bruce, I don't know how much will depress people today, but we'll probably follow a little bit of a similar pattern, because at the end, I'm certainly going to ask you about what's positive and what brings hope. But But let's talk about COVID-19, the coronavirus, a little bit. What stood out to you as you started to look at that about the lack of preparation on a national level?
Yeah, the thing that most struck me, and I have this early in the presentation, which I presume you linked to, if not my
We
Twitter
will,
handle.
absolutely.
Great. I have it pinned in my Twitter handle, but I thought, boy, it'd be interesting if Time Magazine had ever had a cover where maybe they had pointed out that there were pandemic risks, and I could make the point that we shouldn't be surprised as if this had never happened. And I remembered SARS, of course, we all know SARS. So I Googled, Time Magazine cover pandemic, and I got SARS in 2003. I also got bird flu in '04, avian flu in '05, H1N1 in '07, why you'll be wearing masks again in '09, Ebola in 2017, the Bill Gates TED Talk in 2015 that's had 15 million views, and even the National Intelligence Worldwide Threat Assessment, where pandemics were deemed to be one of the biggest risks. And it occurred to me that while uh, this is an overwhelming event for sure, I'm not sure it's not a white swan, because everybody knew this was a risk, and we had, the asteroid had narrowly missed Earth 8 times in a row. Why did we think that was always going to be the case?
Question about Congress. Think back to 9/11, 19 years ago. After that, no plan in place for Congress to work remotely. And it seemed as if in late March, early April this year, we were a bit of a standstill, and maybe even continues a bit in Washington. What is so difficult, or why hasn't steps been taken to allow Congress to be more flexible in the way it gets its work done, in your view?
I don't know that I think of Congress as an innovation leader. It feels often like the only thing Congress likes more than the way things are done is the way things were done. Uh, for some, there is power by having everybody around that certainly moves people out of their districts and out of their states. Um, uh, that's a cynical view. I tend to think there's also the less cynical acknowledgement that whether it's brainstorming or otherwise collaborating, having people together, if you're breaking bread with somebody, if you're spending time with them, if you and your wife go out with them and their wife, you're just more likely to get along, and you're more likely to be able to solve problems. And the founders designed a system predicated on compromise. And if we only see each other on the angertainment that is cable news at night, and if everybody is throwing bombs at everybody else from their district, which may fit the politics of their district, but not necessarily fit the politics of a merged nation, it's just harder to get things done. So I think for some, the leadership sees they have more power, but I also think there's probably an acknowledgement that they've got greater ability to forge compromises that's harder to do if everybody is just at home and just surrounded by the people who think like them.
So, Bruce, every 4 years at least, part of your analysis, part of the trends are what's going to happen in the presidential race. We're talking on June 2nd here, and this will people be listening in early and mid-June. We've got COVID-19 ongoing. We've got racial tensions at a nearly all-time high. Is everything else out the window, so to speak? And if you look ahead to presidential prospects, does it depend on what happens with these two issues going forward?
Certainly these are two huge issues. God forbid we're still dealing with protests and riots 6 months from now, of course. It feels to me that the presidential election is going to be decided in what I think of as 3 lanes: the pandemic, the economy, and what you might call personality. On the pandemic, I suspect it'll be a net advantage for Joe Biden. The president knows that every elected president since 1960 has won or lost on television. And if you watch the president's visuals, he's a master producer of television. The challenge, and he looks like the wartime president he aspires to be. The challenge, of course, is there's also the sound. And there's just a lot of quotes out there and a lot of things that he said that may successfully rile up his base, but that have kept him throughout his presidency below 59% approval. He's net negative approval in the pandemic. Even if he's a wartime president, we're not going to have sort of a VE day, VJ day victory where we all feel, we've made it through the night with a light from above. So pandemic is net Biden advantage. The economy, I actually think, is a net Trump advantage, which seems weird because we're in a recession. Unemployment has more than doubled since last October, probably tripled. I guess we're going to find that out later this week. At the same time, I think the president is setting himself up to be the reopener in chief against Lockdown Joe. Voters continue to give who do you think's more likely to do a good job for the economy, even in the depths of the presidential disapproval right now. They tend to give that as a net Trump advantage. And I think the president will probably be able to argue, I've done it once before. I've had experience in business. He's been a senator for 36 years and a vice president for 8. I am more credible as somebody who can get the economy roaring again. The third lane, the personality, reminds me in the 20th century, the question was always, which of these candidates would you rather grab a beer with more? In the 21st century, it seems to be, which of these candidates would you rather punch in the face less? I think the challenge right there for the president, in 2016, the voters who disliked Trump and disliked Hillary broke for Trump by 17 points. As of the polling this past week, candidates who dislike Trump and dislike Biden are breaking for Biden by 32 points. The Trump theory is, well, we've got months to define him, the way the Obama folks defined Romney, the way the Bush folks defined Kerry. They're going to say that he's too old. They're going to say he's too liberal. They're going to say he's too soft on China. For the Biden folks, they don't need to define the president. He's pretty well defined. I think the question is, can they contrast what they would try to describe as kind of a calm uniter with President Chaos, with somebody who, in his worst moments does offers the kind of statements you saw in Charlottesville, arguably the looting and shooting tweet, that really do threaten his ability to gain the support of suburban moms or others who may think he's got better economic policies, but are just worried about the lack of social cohesion and desire to kind of calm things down.
Well, Bruce, I don't think I'm depressed yet, but the fact that, as you described it, based on who we want to punch in the face less, as opposed to who we'd rather more have a beer with, that's not on the right track. So it goes to that polarization, I guess, we're seeing. One of the slides in your current presentation says no October surprises. All I hear about in conversation stories in the past, there's always October surprises. So what does no October surprises mean in this case?
Well, Tom, I think you got to go back. It says the only October surprise will be no surprises in October. So it's admittedly poor sentence construction. It's negative in a negative. The point is, it's inconceivable there's not going to be an October or November surprise. My personal biggest fear is not either of the candidates winning or losing. I've got my own personal thoughts on the whole thing. But my biggest fear is that the week of the election, you have, a second wave, very likely, of COVID outbreak that requires public health decisions that have huge political impact. So take a state like Texas. If you conclude that the urban areas are less safe as a result of the density of population, so you need to urge lockdown or urge distancing in Dallas and Houston and Austin, and that's going to have a huge impact on Democratic voters and far less on Republican voters. Well, if it's a Republican governor, the odds that we remember, you and I remember Bush v. Gore, and there's still plenty of people who are annoyed about maybe if they just kept counting and kept recounting and kept recounting, they would have come up with a Gore one. That is what it was, but that left a whole lot of ill feelings. I'm just really worried that we're looking at public health decisions that, if you make them, lead to disenfranchisement considerations that are legitimate. The solution, of course, is that we early and now come up with ways to have absentee balloting, ways to have vote by mail, ways to make sure that they're as secure as possible. And you could make that a emergency situation, just in case break the glass. But it's like Congress. It's not that they should switch and start working remotely. It's that they ought to have the capability, if all of the airspace is shut down, maybe they ought to be able to pass legislation without having to, hitch a ride. Likewise, there would be a way to have secure voting that we wouldn't require you to necessarily show up with a mask or or 6 feet apart? And what is that? Can you have more polling places? And is it safe for the poll workers, who tend to be, based upon my experience, at least the average age of 95? How do we ensure that the democratic process doesn't disenfranchise people in the name of public safety, nor risk people in the name of democracy?
Let's talk about Congress a little bit more. You mentioned a couple of ways how it's not going to change. How do you envision that it might change? And by that, I'm talking about from the policy standpoint. Right now, we're adding to already large, tremendous deficit levels. But once this pandemic is under control, so to speak, do you see changes in the way that Congress approaches its business?
So when I've been asked to do a lot of talks about how I see the politics and policy being impacted by COVID, I tend to conclude it's less of a transformative moment and more of an accelerative moment. And then I believe a lot of the trends that were already there are just going to be accelerating. So, for example, we were already amidst trade wars. We were facing what I viewed as deglobalization. I published something on that. The U.S.-China relationship was clearly decoupling. The U.S. didn't feel like we were getting our fair share. The Chinese side thought they should be bigger and more relevant in world affairs and have more of the world approach things in their style, as opposed to the liberal capitalist democratic approach that we tend to have to things. So deglobalization, that's just going to accelerate. We're going to see both this summer and going into next year the U.S.-China decoupling happening. There were concerns about inequality. Inequality, regrettably, is going to get that much worse. My own belief is that the inequality that we've been seeing is more than anything else the product of combination of globalization and technology. And they're not sinister. It's not intentional, how do we screw as many people as we can? It's that technology and globalization have created extraordinary new opportunities for those who have access to capital, those who have the best skills and education, those who are often living in the right cities and working in the right sectors. There aren't and haven't been rules necessarily around data dominance. So it's allowed the Amazons, the Googles to just get to extraordinary positions of power. It reminds me a lot of what led to the invention of antitrust law back when you saw it with Rockefeller. It's not Rockefeller anymore, it's Bezos. But those types of considerations are the same. So it felt like we were heading towards an era of reform and new consumer protections anyway. One of the big debates prior to COVID was whether or not capitalism was working, and people got overwrought about it in my mind. I never thought we were going to become a socialist nation. But I also think the way Senator Marco Rubio of Florida talks about it sometimes, Senator Josh Hawley in even more extreme terms of Missouri talks about it. They talk about sometimes market fundamentalism, and they were noting, and this is a newer feature in the Republican Party, but the inequality reflects inadequate opportunities. The winner's circle was shrinking, and you can believe in market-based solutions and you can believe in capitalism while also believing that something is broken in either how we teach people or how we train kids or how we finance schools or how we create or how we police competition in the marketplace, so that an entrepreneur who busts his tail at a small business and finds that, he gets squashed because he needs to be on Amazon, and then Amazon can just front run him based upon his own data. I don't think that guy is a socialist. I don't think that guy's complaints are anti-capitalist. We saw those trends. They're being accelerated.
So, Bruce, you've been on both sides of this equation between government and technology companies, and I assume that's part of your work today. The volatile relationship, where's it headed? Where do you see that relationship going?
It's the best of times and worst of times for so many in tech. The tech companies were the first to shut down, the first to work remotely. God bless Zoom, which we're talking over today, and the ability to keep people productive, to give you ways to have a happy hour that's not quite the same, but it's a whole lot better than than drinking alone. Tech really does deserve a lot of credit, and you saw so many of the companies that have been successful beyond tech are the digitized. are the folks who had figured out how to leverage the opportunities to access the global marketplace online or to work and empower their employees remotely. That will accelerate. Some people call it the fourth industrial revolution. The venture capitalist Mark Andreessen described it as the phenomenon of software is eating the world. But the trends of the importance of being internet ready, of being mobile, are only going to go forward. But I am, that notwithstanding, there are still the things that caused what some call the techlash, the backlash against some of the big dominant tech companies. That's only going to grow. So concerns that they were market dominant, Facebook, Amazon, Google are more dominant and more powerful than they were going into this thing. And I bet you're going to see an antitrust lawsuit by the United States federal government in multiple states against Google this year, for example, in the United States, abroad against Amazon for sure. Likewise, there was concerns about inadequate privacy and consumer protection. Well, now they're about to have your health data. And while, the United States is big into individual freedom, around the world, totalitarian regimes are leveraging COVID to go full Orwell 1984 dragnets in terms of data. There were concerns about the platforms and whether there was too much censorship, which is the opinion of Donald Trump and some Republicans, or too little censorship and too many, dangerous voices saying factually inaccurate and dangerous misinformation, whether the U.S. or our enemies pretending to be Americans, and they wanted more censorship. Nothing about the COVID experience. There was a story today about how a Twitter handle pretending to be Antifa, anti-fascist, was really a white nationalist group just trying to make the anti-fascist groups look bad. And there is no, on social media, let alone say on Twitter, where people can be anonymous, which is great if you're a whistleblower, or great if you want to say something that's unpopular but important, but really dangerous if you want to say something that's untrue and that misinforms people. The TN GOP, pretending to be the Tennessee GOP, was one of the top 10 Twitter handles in the 2016 elections. It was the Russians, and there ought to be a way to not let them have that handle, but it didn't claim it was the official handle of the party. It just was TN GOP. It led to that misinformation, and then they, their trolls were retweeting all of the right stuff, and they got a big followership. But that's we're gonna have to get our hands around that one.
I was going to say, Bruce, some of the things you're describing there, I would put under the disruption label, so to speak. So many in technology embrace disruption and the positive aspects of it, and rightfully so. So many others fear disruption. Where do you see that going, again, as we look forward, that concept of disruption?
Well, I think it's the defining characteristic. One of the things about politics, especially the worst, is family dinners where you're with all of the people who don't do politics for a living, and if the gravy's too thick, your progressive relatives say Donald Trump's to blame. And if it's an especially good turkey that week, well, why? Because Trump's the president. It's like, no, it has nothing to do with the president. Like, why is everything a Rorschach test about your politics? It feels like we're definitely in an era of disruption, but Donald Trump is a symptom, not a cause. The cause are the concurrent changes and trends in technology, geopolitics, and culture over the last 3 to 5 decades. So over the last 3 to 5 decades in technology, everything became digitized, everything became networked, everything increasingly is mobile, and you have the rise of social media. That's led to a lot of this winner-take-all superstar as economy, as McKinsey describes it, but it's led to the backlash there, and it led to people feeling disrupted in their businesses. In geopolitics, the end of the Cold War was awesome, but that was the defining characteristic of the world that I grew up in. Everything kind of made sense, East versus West, good guys versus bad guys. Suddenly, the former Soviet bloc, with changes in India, with changes in China, all came onto the global economy. The EU, that was all in 91, 92, and 93. The EU was born in 1993. NAFTA was passed in 94. And the World Trade Organization in 94. We had hyperglobalization. That was really disruptive for a lot of folks. We've seen the backlash against globalization. Culturally, we've gone to a far more diverse nation, a far more opportunity for women nation. Just in so many ways, we are better and we are stronger. At the same time as the protests highlight, notwithstanding that we are 50 years since some of the great civil rights progress whether it's the 65 Voting Rights Act and the 64 Civil Rights Act, if you're an African American today, you are still far more disproportionately likely to be pulled over by the police. Senator Tim Scott has pointed out he's pulled over 7 different times. He's a United States senator in a suit wearing a pin that reflects he's a United States senator, and yet there is that kind of profiling that goes on. You can't even begin to excuse the George Floyd stuff. But we've still got a lot of these challenges that you combine all of these changes that have been happening over a lot of decades, people feel really disrupted, and it's going to accelerate. So what we really need, and we saw these same things again in the Gilded Age, is we need a leader who unifies the nation, that brings people together. Some of that may require a media that's not quite so team red versus team blue, because right now, if you get your news from Fox, the impeachment was a hoax. The president is trying to unite the nation, and there are, national terror groups that are blocking. And if you get your news from CNN or Fox, this is what the impeachment clause was written for, and that the president is intentionally dividing the country to rally his base. And as long as we all enter discussions of policy and elections with our own set of truths, it's going to be hard to unite the country.
Well, there you are correct. There are very few middle grounds when it comes to the media these days. So I don't think we've depressed people over the last 30 minutes. We'll chalk that up as an accomplishment. But you've presented a realistic look at where we are and where we might be headed. There are challenges, there are concerns, but what are some of those reasons for hope? What are some of the reasons to be positive going forward?
I've got a lot in my mind, from first just the inspirational examples set by all of the people whose names I don't know, who are nurses and doctors and hospitals or clinics. The people at the grocery store who were there, and the truck drivers who deliver their the supplies, so that all of us who have been working or living out of our homes can remain fed. They're just everyday heroes, not wearing capes, but are fabulous. We also have seen, and I always go hunting for, because the news, look, it's clickbait. Happy news isn't clickbait. They want to find the worst possible stories, but there are all these great stories out there too, of communities that have come together and are distancing, making communities stronger, and people supporting one another. And it's the kids who are getting groceries for the old folks, just to pick on one example I'd recently read about. But it's also, again, as a student of history, America always comes back. We always come back better and smarter and stronger. To torture the Churchill quote, we sometimes do the wrong thing, or it takes us a little while to get there. But whether it's post-Civil War and our ability to rise from those ashes to become the most powerful nation on earth, or post Great Depression and World War II, where we literally led the world and helped freedom overcome autocracy of communism. Sputnik went up first, but we then went to the moon, and we invented the internet. Americans major in comebacks, and I think we're going to find one of those that allows us to not only have a more resilient and inclusive and effective healthcare system, so that future pandemics are not as overwhelming as this one is unfortunately proving to be, and thank God it's not more lethal. But I also think we're going to figure out those sort of reforms that marry what makes markets and capitalism so great and so powerful and the best in the world with some of the realities in the 21st century that are presently making the winner's circle too small. And I'm very hopeful that ours will be a more diverse nation with far more opportunities for innovators and entrepreneurs 20 and 30 years from now. Getting there is the hard part.
So I hear you say we've got a 244-year track record as a country of being successful, of coming back, and hopefully that will prove beneficial going forward.
That's my hope.
Bruce, last question as we wrap up. We always ask people, give their perspective on something, and then the question, I'll throw it out to you, is what does success mean to you? And you can think about that from a personal perspective, from a professional perspective, but as you look at your work and what you do, what at the end of the day has been a good day or a successful time for Bruce Mehlman?
Well, I'll start macro and probably ought to end macro too. But yeah, I don't know if you know the writer David Brooks.
Yes.
He's a right of center, albeit writes in the New York Times, but that's useful. They've got a couple there, Ross Douthat, Brett Stevens, who I think are all terrific. And Brooks at one point wrote this great piece that he put in some couple of books as well, where he describes the resume virtues and the eulogy virtues. And on the resume virtues, he talks about the things that might make you professionally successful, and whether that's, fame or fortune or renown. And then he talks about the eulogy virtues, which, when they're speaking about your life and you've just passed, what do you want them to say about you? And usually it's not, I wish I had worked a little bit harder and had been a little bit more famous and, had gotten on TV a few more times. It boils down to, were you a good father and son and husband and neighbor? And were the people that you worked with made better by having you as a colleague? For me, I try. It's really easy to get stuck in the micro, and 100% certain I do all the time. And you measure these narrow things. I mean, the stupid stuff that I publish every quarter. How many people downloaded it? That's a really small, narrow metric that I might have. But I try, and at times such as a, global pandemic where, we're in recession and all locked down, you get to spend a little bit more time trying to think about those big questions. And I'm one of the more pandemic positive people I know, because I'm finding a bunch of silver linings. And the silver linings could be as stupid and small as the fact that we've got a flowering cherry tree in front of our home that flowers roughly 3 weeks a year. And I'd leave in the mornings when it was dark, and I'd get home in the evening when it was dark, and I'd see it like on a weekend, and then I feel like I'd see it 2 days a year, and then the rain would knock all the petals out. That's right outside my home office. So yeah, I was locked down, but it was glorious it felt like at least all the 3 weeks. Or I love my family. I'm lucky enough that I got 2 kids of the 3 in college, yet part of my brain realized, man, the number of family dinners where it's just the 5 of us, where nobody's got a wife or a girlfriend, where it's not extended family, which again is a great, fortunate thing for, say, a Thanksgiving. But I realized that I don't know how few just the 5 of us dinners are left. I probably doubled the aggregate number. So I'm finding a lot of silver linings. I'm finding ways to, if you measure success small enough, fixing the bed really well, it's easy to have a lot of small successes through the day.
Well, Bruce Mehlman, thanks so much for joining us today, sharing your insights. I know you do that on a regular, constant basis. We hope to bring you to Indiana at some point in person, but thank you for this time and sharing your perspective with our listeners today.
Thanks for having me today.
Absolutely. A couple of closing comments here as Bruce kind of wrapped up with some of those positives. The Chamber's coronavirus resource page is now the Road to Recovery page, presenting various resources, both government assistance, practical back to the office applications and information that you can use. You can access any of the 17 free webinars the Chamber has conducted thus far on just those same topics. We encourage you to utilize those resources. Our business education and events that so many of you are familiar with as part of the Chamber, those will continue on a virtual basis throughout the summer, hopefully returning to some in-person, combination in-person virtual sessions as we move on in the fall. Thank you as always for listening to the In Chamber. We'll be back in 2 weeks with our next conversation.